So yeah, hello everyone. My name is Arturo Tablan, and I'm currently a master's student at the University of the Philippines, Diliman, Archaeological Studies program, and I'm a graduate, undergraduate, graduate at the University of Concordia, doing and I've done a joint specialization in anthropology and sociology, and minored in classical archaeology. So very much similar to Eleanor's background. But today, I'm tackling a part of the world that also, to me, has been unknown for quite some time and only recently entered my spheres of interest. Um, so my degree here has led me to look at the oceanic world and its implications in the both regional archaeology and in greater perspective. I've grown to love this particular region of Oceania, particularly the Central Pacific and more specifically the island of Fiji. And my hope today is to convey this fascination of Fiji and why I think it's an important part of the Pacific region. But before I delve too deep into this, I want to start with a disclaimer, as as I encountered all these different papers and different levels of studies in Fiji. Um, this was a history that, although isn't too different with other parts of the world, was very new to me. So terms like Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia were very racially charged. Um, these terms weren't applied in the nicest of sense, with Melanesia being the worst of them, and no, Micronesia being the worst of them, but Melanesia and Polynesia also being quite racially charged. So I just want to be aware of that history um, as we interact with this history. Although the modern usage has shifted more towards a rather geographical usage, and these racialized terms have become less dramatic. I just want to mention this, as it's very important to the history of these people, and I don't want to say these things lightly, especially since I'll be saying them in quite a few times. There is a shift towards a rather more neutral term, but due to the fact that this presentation deals with a lot of older material and material that uses the Melanesian, Micronesian, Polynesian scheme uh, to to geographically set a lot of these different peoples in their geographical locations. I'll be sticking with the rather antiquated, in my view, naming convention. So what do I aim to do in this presentation? Well, my goal is to present the ethnogenesis of the Fijian Isles and its centrality to the Pacific. So what is ethnogenesis specifically? Well, ethnogenesis is the genesis, as you can see in the latter part of the word. So the creation of an ethnic group and its development over time. So from the Fijian Isles, this genesis has largely to do with its geographical location in the Pacific. And I'll be using the fields of genetics, linguistics, zooarchaeology, and archaeology to make these claims. Although I delved into a um, couple different fields in my paper, I use these four specifically because I think they drive the point home the most straightforward way. So, why Fiji? Again, as I've been sort of reiterating, its geographical location is central to why I find Fiji fascinating, and why many other academics followed me and or had had that same interest before me. Um, there are oceanic migrations that play a key factor to this, but also an intra Fijian network that spans within the islands of Fiji and to the greater Pacific region. So, just for a quick sort of background uh, of the oceanic region, um, sort of what we know today as the greater Pacific area, from islands Southeast Asia, the zones of Micronesia, Melanesia, Polynesia, and as far as Madagascar, um, were populated by what we call the Austronesian speaking people. So these people would have originated on the island of Taiwan, and were a seafaring people that gravitated towards island colonization, and as you could see, colonized a large part of the world. So the voyage that we are particularly looking at today goes from the Philippines, northern New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, and ends in Fiji, but also comes into play with Samoa and Tonga to the east. Uh, yeah, so as you can see, within this central area here, Fiji is located between the regions of Polynesia and Melanesia. Micronesia, it's also within the sphere of Micronesia, but that has a less significant influence than the two rather significant zones of Melanesia and Polynesia. We'll see time and time again that the movements in between both of these zones come into effect when shaping the Fijian identity. As you could see, Polynesian and Melanesian influences across the board. So, looking specifically at the Fijian Isles, it's roughly 300 islands that spans 18,000 square kilometers in landmass. That's not taking into account the vast amount of oceans found in between the islands, which increase the factor of how big this modern day nation and um, historical island people were. It's generally sectioned off in general terms into an eastern and western division. But as you can see in this secondary part right here, you could further subdivide into a western region, a central region, eastern region, northern region, and Ratama. I'll get into the specifics of why this could be, why further divisions happen. But in general terms, this is how I will be referring to Fiji. So I'm going to start with genetics because I feel that it's really, really important to look at the genetics as it was sort of my entry point into observing Fiji, but also it could sort of it acts as a primary point to trickle down the rest of the fields to look at. So historically, the Fijian people have been grouped together through a single genetic group. When genetics was at the beginning of its point of study, um, geneticists looked at the Oceanic peoples as separate regional variants. So people from Samara, from Tonga, from Fiji. But moving in more recent times to 2015 and 2016, the publications by Gerard Shipley looked specifically at the diversity within the isles themselves. He looked at specific haplogroups found within the Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA to trace the genetic lineages of the Fijian people. The Y chromosome indicated the father's lineages, and the mtDNA indicated the mother lineages. So this was of uh, a diagram of his findings, very, very generally, as these genetic papers can go into very, very deep and explanative ways of describing all these different haplogroups. But generally, he grouped um, the different leanings towards Asian descended, and Polynesian haplogroups, and Melanesian haplogroups. And then he further subdivided um, the regional variants into the islands of Viti Levu, Vanua Levu, Kadabu, the Lao Island Group, and Ratama. Now, as you can see, there are very different genetic affiliations of both the father's side, which is the left circle, and the mother's side on the right circle. And depending on the island, um, these affiliation levels um, differ greatly. He proposed using the newer near and remote oceanic scheme to divide Fiji along this line, where the Lao Island group and Ratama belong to the remote Oceania population, while the rest of the what some call the core island group belong to the Melanesian or near oceanic group. Um, I don't know how I feel about this, to be quite honest, because although it does make sense and his arguments are valid, it sort of takes away the unique features of the Fijian Islands. And what makes it so special is the fact that although there is this drastic sense of this very um, this very delineated way of viewing the island populations, what I feel is very much a feature of the Fijian identity is this interconnectedness between the Fijian Islands, but also the greater Pacific. And the second, which probably was one of the first ways that the Fijian Islands were studied, was linguistics. So two works that are fundamental to the linguistical analysis of the Fijian language was Pali and Sayaba in 1971 and Gerarti in 1983. Although these weren't the first works that necessarily observed the Fijian language, these ones were quite extensive and sort of formed the way um, that we observe the Fijian language and sort of form the greater, what we like to call Proto-Austronesian language family. So on the right over here is Andrew Pali's and Timosi Sabaya's um, language tree. And as you can see, it falls along this line into the Fijian languages. Now, the Fijian languages can roughly be divided along two lines, the Eastern and Western communalex. Now, communalex are generally described as languages that belong to a given region, whether it be a village or an entire island. But what's most important is that the practitioners of this language associate themselves in a similar language. Now, what's really, really interesting about these two communalex is that the similarities of these languages are as close as English and German in their modern sense. So they although they do share some similarities, there's quite a distance in between these two languages. Now that plays into their hypothesis that these languages have been divided for a very long time, and um, it's quite interesting when you compare it to the similar genetic archaeological evidences that I'll be discussing further. So the eastern western divide can be demarcated by the inland island range of Viti Levu. So the island of Viti Levu, and this is the inland mountain range. Although there are a couple exceptions where the western communal can be found in eastern parts of this mountain range and vice versa. That is the general trend that can be found along the language barrier that is the mountain. So, interestingly enough, the western region is the only part that that practices this western communal along with other islands. The eastern part pretty much covers all the other islands. So Vanuatu, Kadavu, the Lau Island Group, and Ratama. And this language group is mostly centered around a network that is centered around the Koro Sea and was had its sphere of influence helmed at the southwest point, southeast point of Viti Levu, most likely around the modern day capital of Suva. But there are a couple limitations um, with the historical linguistics, as you can't have a specific time and date and place. You just get general trends, and that's where the archaeological factors come into play. So the Pacific Islands have a unique relationship with zooarchaeology, as they are islands. They are enclosed ecosystems, especially the ones further out east, as the distance that divide them becomes greater and greater, and interactions between animals, plants, becomes cut off um, due to this great distance. But uh, uh, I just realized that there's only a couple minutes left. Uh, but as this distance grows, uh, we could find a very interesting dynamic as people move throughout the Pacific. So animals moved along the Pacific, people, goods such as ceramics and obsidian that have been notable in the archaeological record, and that very much plays into this dynamic of Fiji being um, having interactions between islands in Tonga and Samoa, Vanuatu, New Caledonia, and even as far as the Bismarck Archipelago and the Solomons. So, where do we stand in this? Well, the Fijian Islands have long been, viewed as this rather isolated group of people. But as we have seen, um, through its genetics, the linguistics, uh, the archaeology and zooarchaeology, there is um, this great dichotomy of the Fijian Islands, where there are a lot of endemic developments of the language. I didn't get a time to say it, but there's a lot of archaeological developments with their ceramics, um, with their trade. But it is Fiji is very very interesting in the way that its trans-Pacificness it shines through its identity, and it really is, in my view, this uh, this crossroads of Oceania, as as expressed through their culture.